Have you ever sent a private text message, searched for something personal online, or made a phone call believing nobody else was listening? Most people assume those moments belong only to them. But what if one individual discovered evidence suggesting that governments had developed the capability to collect vast amounts of digital information on an unprecedented scale? What if that person risked everything, his career, his home, his future, and even his freedom, to reveal what he believed the public deserved to know? In 2013, a quiet computer specialist shocked the world by exposing some of the most secretive surveillance programs ever revealed. Within days, he became one of the most controversial figures of the 21st century. To some, he was a courageous whistleblower who defended civil liberties. To others, he was a man who endangered national security and exposed sensitive intelligence operations. More than a decade later, people are still arguing over a simple question. Was Edward Snowden a hero, a traitor, or something far more complicated? Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This video is intended for educational and documentary purposes. It presents publicly reported information, historical events, and differing viewpoints surrounding Edward Snowden and the surveillance disclosures of 2013. The goal is to inform, not to promote any political position or endorse any individual, government, or organization. To understand how Edward Snowden became one of the most recognizable whistleblowers in modern history, we have to start long before the headlines, before the leaks, and before governments around the world found themselves scrambling to answer uncomfortable questions. Edward Joseph Snowden was born in North Carolina in 1983 and grew up in a family closely connected to public service. His father served in the United States Coast Guard, while his mother worked within the federal court system. Government service was not something distant or abstract in the Snowden household. It was part of everyday life. Like many young Americans growing up during the rapid expansion of the internet, Snowden developed a fascination with computers. While other children spent countless hours outside, he became increasingly absorbed by technology, networks, and the emerging digital world that was transforming society. The internet of the 1990s felt different from the one we know today. It was often viewed as a frontier of creativity, innovation, and freedom. To many early users, it represented a space where information could move freely and where individuals could communicate without traditional barriers. Snowden embraced that vision. He became largely self-taught, spending countless hours learning about computer systems, programming, and network security. Even at a young age, he demonstrated an ability to understand complex technological concepts that many professionals struggled to master. Then came September 11th, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the United States changed the country in ways that are still being debated today. Like millions of Americans, Snowden watched the events unfold with shock and anger. He believed his country had been attacked, and he wanted to contribute to its defense. Motivated by a sense of patriotism, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and hoped to join the Special Forces. At the time, he viewed military service as a direct way to protect the values he believed in. But fate intervened. During training, Snowden suffered serious injuries that ended his military ambitions before they could truly begin. His military career was over almost as quickly as it had started. For many people, such a setback might have completely altered their future plans. For Snowden, however, it redirected them. Unable to serve on a physical battlefield, he increasingly focused on the digital one. His technical skills continued to grow, and eventually those skills attracted the attention of the American intelligence community. Snowden began working in roles connected to national security and information technology. Over time, he gained access to systems and responsibilities that few people his age could have imagined. His reputation for technical competence allowed him to move through positions that exposed him to increasingly sensitive information. Eventually, Snowden joined the Central Intelligence Agency. For a young man fascinated by technology and motivated by a desire to serve his country, it seemed like a remarkable achievement. The CIA offered opportunities, responsibility, and access to some of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in the world. By his mid-20s, Snowden was stationed in Geneva, Switzerland, working in information security roles that supported American intelligence activities. From the outside, his career appeared highly successful. He had access to influential circles, worked in an elite environment, and enjoyed opportunities that most people never experience. Yet during this period, Snowden later claimed that some of his assumptions about government operations began to change. Working inside the intelligence world exposed him to realities that were far more complex than the idealistic image he had once held. Intelligence agencies operate in environments filled with secrecy, geopolitical competition, and difficult ethical decisions. Supporters of intelligence work often argue that such measures are necessary to protect national security. Critics, meanwhile, contend that secrecy can sometimes shield questionable practices from public scrutiny. For Snowden, these experiences reportedly planted the first seeds of doubt. By 2009, he left the CIA and moved into contracting work connected to the National Security Agency, commonly known as the NSA. The transition would ultimately place him in a position that would change not only his life, but also the global conversation about privacy, technology, and government power. Working as an intelligence contractor offered Snowden access to highly advanced computer systems and classified information. His technical expertise made him valuable, and his responsibilities continued to expand. Eventually, he found himself working in Hawaii, a location that many people would consider close to paradise. He earned an impressive salary, lived comfortably, and shared his life with his longtime girlfriend, Lindsay Mills. From the outside, everything appeared stable. Yet behind secure doors and restricted networks, Snowden was encountering information that deeply concerned him. According to Snowden's later statements, he became increasingly troubled by surveillance programs that collected vast amounts of communications data. He believed that technological capabilities were evolving faster than public understanding and oversight. Government officials, however, argued that intelligence programs were subject to legal authorization and played an important role in protecting the country from terrorism and foreign threats. The debate that would eventually divide the world had already begun, even if most people didn't know it yet. As Snowden continued working within the intelligence system, he found himself confronting a difficult question. How much surveillance is too much surveillance? How much privacy should citizens sacrifice in exchange for security? And who gets to decide where that line is drawn? Those questions would soon push him toward a decision that would make him one of the most famous and controversial figures of the digital age. What happened next would trigger one of the largest intelligence scandals in modern history. The questions that had been building in Edward Snowden's mind for years were no longer theoretical. Sitting in secure facilities and working with classified systems, he had access to information that very few people would ever see. According to Snowden, what concerned him most was not the existence of intelligence gathering itself, something every major nation conducts, but the scale at which modern technology appeared to make surveillance possible. He later argued that governments now possessed capabilities far beyond what most citizens understood, and that the public deserved to know how those capabilities were being used. At the same time, supporters of intelligence agencies maintained that surveillance programs were operating under legal authorities approved by courts and lawmakers. Following the September 11th attacks, the United States had dramatically expanded counterterrorism efforts, and intelligence officials argued that advanced monitoring tools were essential for identifying threats before lives were lost. The fundamental disagreement was not whether governments should collect intelligence. The disagreement centered on how much power governments should have, how transparent those programs should be, and how much oversight was truly taking place. For Snowden, those questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. By early 2013, he had reportedly reached a conclusion that would alter the course of his life. If the public was going to debate privacy, surveillance, and security, he believed they first needed access to information. Without knowledge, there could be no informed discussion. Without transparency, there could be no meaningful consent. The decision he faced was extraordinary. Remaining silent meant preserving everything he had worked for. Speaking out meant risking almost everything. Snowden understood the consequences. Classified information is protected by some of the strictest laws in the United States. Unauthorized disclosure could lead to criminal prosecution, imprisonment, financial ruin, and permanent exile. Even if he believed he was acting in the public interest, there was no guarantee that the public would agree. Despite those risks, Snowden moved forward. Over a period of months, he reportedly collected documents that he believed would demonstrate the scope of certain surveillance programs. He later stated that his objective was not to release information indiscriminately, but to provide documents to journalists who could evaluate them, verify them, and determine what was newsworthy. This distinction would become central to his defense. Snowden argued that he was not attempting to expose legitimate intelligence operations for their own sake. Rather, he wanted journalists to make independent decisions about what information the public should see. As preparations continued, Snowden carefully planned his next move. In May 2013, he informed colleagues that he would be taking time away from work. He also told his girlfriend that he would be traveling for medical reasons. Few people around him suspected that he was about to become the center of an international controversy. He boarded a flight to Hong Kong. The choice was strategic. At the time, Hong Kong operated under a legal framework distinct from mainland China, and had a reputation for relatively strong protections regarding freedom of expression and press activity. Snowden believed it would provide a temporary environment in which journalists could safely review the documents. After arriving, he checked into a hotel and waited. The next stage of his plan involved journalists he had been communicating with through encrypted channels. Among them were Glenn Greenwald, a journalist known for challenging government power, and Laura Poitras, an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose work often focused on national security and civil liberties. Also involved was journalist Ewan McCaskill. For months, Snowden had been carefully vetting contacts and establishing secure communications to avoid detection. When the journalists finally arrived in Hong Kong, they encountered someone who looked very different from the image many people might imagine when thinking about a government whistleblower. Snowden was only 29 years old. He was calm, soft-spoken, and surprisingly ordinary in appearance. There were no dramatic disguises, no elaborate spy gadgets, and no cinematic theatrics. Yet the information he possessed would soon dominate headlines around the globe. Inside the hotel room, Snowden began explaining the documents. As journalists reviewed the material, they recognized that the disclosures could have enormous implications. The documents appeared to reveal surveillance activities that had never been publicly discussed in such detail. Editors and reporters immediately faced difficult decisions. Publishing sensitive information carried risks. Failing to publish information that might affect public understanding of government power also carried risks. The responsibility was enormous. Then, on June 5, 2013, the first major story appeared. The Guardian published a report describing a secret court order involving the collection of telephone metadata from Verizon customers. The revelation immediately generated intense debate. Intelligence officials emphasized that metadata was not the same as listening to phone calls, and argued that such information helped identify patterns connected to terrorism investigations. Privacy advocates, however, questioned whether collecting data on such a large scale was compatible with constitutional protections and civil liberties. The story quickly spread across the world, but it was only the beginning. Soon afterward, additional reports revealed details about a highly classified surveillance program known as PRISM. According to published documents, the program allowed the government to obtain certain forms of digital data from major technology companies through legal processes. The disclosures sparked widespread confusion, concern, and debate. Some reports initially suggested direct government access to company servers, while technology companies strongly denied such characterizations and stated that they complied only with lawful requests. The public conversation exploded. Many people were shocked to discover how deeply modern communication systems have become intertwined with intelligence gathering. Others argued that these programs reflected the realities of a post-9/11 security environment. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Newspapers dedicated front pages to the revelations. Political leaders demanded explanations. Technology companies rushed to reassure users about privacy protections. Around the world, citizens suddenly found themselves asking questions that had rarely been discussed outside intelligence circles. Who has access to our data? How much information is collected? What safeguards actually exist? And who is watching the watchers? As the disclosures continued, governments and intelligence agencies found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. Congressional hearings intensified. Privacy advocates organized campaigns demanding reform. International allies sought clarification regarding surveillance activities that appeared to extend beyond American borders. Meanwhile, one question dominated news coverage: who was responsible for the leak? For several days, speculation filled television studios and newspaper columns. Experts debated whether the source was a senior official, a foreign spy, or perhaps an organized group of insiders. The answer turned out to be something very different. Edward Snowden decided not to remain anonymous. He later explained that he did not want colleagues or innocent employees to become targets of suspicion. He also believed that standing behind his actions was a matter of personal responsibility. Rather than hiding indefinitely, he chose to publicly identify himself. On June 9, 2013, the world finally saw the face behind the headlines. In a video interview recorded by Laura Poitras, Snowden calmly explained why he had disclosed the information. He spoke about privacy, government accountability, and his belief that citizens should understand programs conducted in their name. The interview immediately became one of the most discussed news events of the year. The reaction was explosive. To supporters, Snowden appeared thoughtful, principled, and willing to sacrifice everything for a cause he believed in. To critics, he had recklessly exposed classified information and potentially damaged national security. Within hours, political commentators, lawmakers, intelligence officials, journalists, and citizens across the globe were fiercely debating his motives. The United States government responded quickly. Federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against Snowden, including allegations related to theft of government property and violations of the Espionage Act. Officials argued that the unauthorized disclosure of classified information posed serious risks and could undermine intelligence operations. Snowden and his supporters countered that the disclosures had sparked an essential public debate that otherwise might never have occurred. Suddenly, the 29-year-old former contractor found himself at the center of a global storm. Every major news network wanted interviews. Governments demanded answers. Allies expressed concern. Critics demanded prosecution. Supporters praised his actions. And somewhere in Hong Kong, Edward Snowden was watching the world react to information that had once existed only inside classified systems. But while the public focused on the debate, a new reality was rapidly approaching. The legal pressure was mounting. Extradition discussions were accelerating. Diplomatic channels were becoming increasingly active. And Snowden was about to discover that exposing secrets was only the beginning of his story. The next challenge would not be revealing information. It would be staying free. By the summer of 2013, Edward Snowden had become one of the most recognizable people on Earth. What began as a series of leaked documents had evolved into a geopolitical crisis involving governments, intelligence agencies, journalists, diplomats, and millions of ordinary citizens. The debate over surveillance was now global. But for Snowden himself, the situation had become intensely personal. The question was no longer whether he would face consequences. The question was where those consequences would catch up to him. As pressure mounted in Hong Kong, Snowden understood that remaining there indefinitely was becoming increasingly difficult. The United States government had made clear that it intended to pursue legal action, and discussions regarding his status were accelerating. Around the world, news organizations tracked his every move. Governments monitored developments closely. Every decision now carried international implications. In June 2013, Snowden departed Hong Kong and boarded a flight to Moscow. The trip was intended to be part of a broader journey toward a country where he hoped to obtain asylum. However, events quickly became far more complicated than anyone anticipated. By the time his aircraft landed in Russia, his American passport had been revoked. Suddenly, Snowden found himself trapped in a legal and diplomatic gray zone. He was physically present at Moscow's Sheremetyevo International Airport, yet his ability to travel onward had effectively disappeared. What followed became one of the most unusual episodes in modern political history. For weeks, Snowden remained inside the airport transit area while governments around the world debated his future. News crews gathered outside. Journalists attempted to track every development. Diplomats engaged in behind-the-scenes negotiations. Around the globe, television audiences followed the story almost like a real-life political thriller. The airport became a symbol of the strange reality Snowden now inhabited. He was neither entirely free nor formally detained. He existed in a space where legal systems, international politics, and public opinion intersected in unpredictable ways. During this period, Snowden submitted asylum requests to numerous countries. Some governments declined, others avoided direct involvement. Political considerations weighed heavily on every decision. Offering protection to the world's most famous whistleblower carried significant diplomatic consequences. Meanwhile, relations between Washington and Moscow became increasingly strained. The situation generated controversy far beyond Snowden himself. Governments debated sovereignty, extradition, privacy, intelligence cooperation, and international law. Every development was scrutinized by media outlets worldwide. Then came another dramatic moment. In July 2013, rumors emerged suggesting that Snowden might be traveling aboard the aircraft of Bolivian President Evo Morales. Several European countries temporarily restricted airspace access to the presidential plane, forcing it to alter its route and make an unexpected landing. Snowden was not on board, but the incident generated significant diplomatic backlash and further demonstrated how extraordinary the situation had become. Eventually, Snowden's immediate uncertainty came to an end. Russia granted him temporary asylum, allowing him to leave the airport and begin a new chapter of his life. What had originally been intended as a transit stop became a long-term reality. Over time, temporary protection evolved into permanent residency and eventually Russian citizenship. For many observers, this development became one of the most controversial aspects of Snowden's story. Critics argued that living in Russia undermined his credibility and created uncomfortable questions regarding geopolitical interests. Supporters countered that his options had become extremely limited and that accepting asylum was a practical decision rather than a political endorsement. The disagreement reflected the broader divide that had surrounded Snowden from the beginning. Yet while arguments about his personal choices continued, the consequences of the disclosures themselves were spreading across the world. Technology companies found themselves facing unprecedented scrutiny regarding data security and privacy. Users increasingly demanded stronger protections. Public awareness of digital surveillance expanded dramatically. Terms that had once been discussed primarily among security professionals suddenly became part of mainstream conversation. Encryption became a major focus. Before the revelations, many internet users rarely thought about how their data traveled across networks. In the years that followed, companies accelerated efforts to strengthen security features and improve privacy protections. End-to-end encryption, secure communications, and enhanced cybersecurity practices became increasingly common topics among both businesses and consumers. The legal and political impact was also significant. Lawmakers held hearings, courts reviewed surveillance authorities, advocacy groups pushed for reforms, government officials defended programs they considered necessary for national security, while critics called for greater transparency and oversight. One of the most notable legislative outcomes came in 2015 with the passage of the USA Freedom Act. Supporters viewed the legislation as an important reform that altered certain government data collection practices. Others argued that deeper changes were still needed. Regardless of perspective, few disputed that the public debate sparked by the Snowden disclosures played a role in reshaping conversations about surveillance policy. Internationally, the effects were equally profound. Governments examined their own intelligence practices. Privacy regulations became increasingly important in many jurisdictions. Technology firms invested heavily in security infrastructure. Citizens around the world became more aware of how much personal information existed within digital systems. In many ways, Snowden's disclosures helped transform privacy from a niche policy topic into a mainstream global issue. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of the story is that the central debate remains unresolved. Supporters continue to view Snowden as a whistleblower who sacrificed a comfortable life to expose information he believed the public deserved to know. They argue that democratic societies require transparency and informed public debate, particularly when government powers expand into new technological territory. Critics continue to argue that classified information exists for a reason, and that unauthorized disclosures can create serious risks. They maintain that intelligence agencies play a critical role in preventing threats, and that exposing sensitive capabilities may have consequences that extend far beyond public discussion. These two perspectives have existed side by side for more than a decade, and perhaps that is why Edward Snowden's story continues to resonate. Unlike many historical controversies that eventually settle into clear categories of right and wrong, this one remains deeply complex. It touches fundamental questions about freedom, security, trust, technology, and power. It forces societies to confront difficult trade-offs that become more relevant with each passing year. Today, we live in a world where smartphones accompany us everywhere, where digital services manage enormous portions of our daily lives, and where unprecedented amounts of information move through networks every second. The questions raised in 2013 have not disappeared. If anything, they have become even more important. How much privacy should individuals expect in a connected world? How much surveillance authority should governments possess? Who should oversee those powers? And how can societies balance security with freedom in an age where technology evolves faster than legislation? Regardless of where one stands on Edward Snowden himself, those questions are likely to shape the future for decades to come. More than 10 years after the leaks, the man at the center of the storm remains a figure of intense debate. Some see a defender of civil liberties. Others see a man who crossed a line that should never have been crossed. History has not yet delivered a final verdict. But one thing is certain. In a single year, one relatively unknown contractor forced governments, corporations, journalists, and ordinary citizens across the globe to confront issues that had largely remained hidden from public view. Very few individuals have altered the global conversation in such a dramatic way. Whether remembered as a whistleblower, a dissident, a controversial figure, or a catalyst for change, Edward Snowden left a mark on the digital age that cannot be ignored. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this. The documents may have been classified. The governments may have controlled vast resources. The intelligence agencies may have possessed extraordinary capabilities. Yet the debate that followed ultimately belonged to the public. Because in the end, the story was never only about Edward Snowden. It was about a question every generation must answer for itself. How much freedom are people willing to trade for security? And who gets to decide?